The Millionaire 7-Eleven owner takes in a boy caught stealing from his store and uncovers a life-changing secret. Dallas, with its towering skyline and buzzing streets, was a city that never seemed to rest. Jeremiah Carter, owner of the country's largest chain of convenience stores, sat in his office on the 32nd floor of a glassy skyscraper, gazing out at the bustling city below. To the world, Jeremiah was a man who had it all: wealth, power, and the respect that came with his success. Yet, behind the polished suits and cold demeanor was a man weighed down by the emptiness that no amount of money could fill. At 42, Jeremiah had built his empire from the ground up, but he had paid a steep price. His days were now consumed by numbers and business meetings, leaving little room for personal connections or a sense of purpose. That night, however, something unusual broke the monotony: a notification on his phone. The alert was from one of his stores in a struggling neighborhood on the outskirts of Dallas, an area Jeremiah hadn't thought about in years. It wasn't the location that caught his attention. It was the nature of the alert. The motion sensors had detected an intruder. Normally, this would be handled by store security, but a strange curiosity compelled Jeremiah to intervene personally. Arriving at the store, Jeremiah was greeted by the nervous manager, who immediately began explaining. "Sir, we caught him red-handed. It's just a kid, probably no older than 12 or 13. He was trying to steal some candy." Jeremiah's brow furrowed. "A kid?" "Yes, sir," the manager replied, motioning toward the back room. "We didn't call the police. We thought it'd be best if you decided what to do." Jeremiah nodded and walked toward the small office in the back of the store. As he pushed the door open, he was met with a sight that stopped him in his tracks. Sitting in the chair, clutching a candy bar as if it were the most valuable thing in the world, was a boy with tangled hair, dirt-streaked cheeks, and eyes that burned with defiance despite the fear evident in his trembling hands. "What's your name?" Jeremiah asked, his voice steady but soft. The boy glared at him, his jaw tightening before he answered reluctantly. "Julian, and I didn't steal. I was just taking what I needed." Jeremiah raised an eyebrow. "Taking what you needed? Huh? Why don't you explain that to me?" Julian's expression faltered, but he quickly masked it with anger. "I don't have anyone, okay? No family, no home. I just needed something to eat. That's it." Jeremiah felt a strange pang in his chest as he listened. There was something eerily familiar about Julian's situation. He couldn't help but think back to his own childhood in the very same neighborhood, a time when he, too, had felt invisible and desperate. "You know," Jeremiah said, folding his arms, "a candy bar isn't going to keep you alive for long. If you're hungry, why didn't you just ask for help?" Julian's grip on the candy bar tightened. "Because I don't need anyone's pity. I don't need yours." Jeremiah stared at the boy for a long moment, his mind racing. He could have easily dismissed the situation, handed Julian over to the authorities, and gone back to his life. But something about the boy's fiery spirit and desperate circumstances made it impossible for him to walk away. "All right, Julian," Jeremiah finally said, crouching down to meet the boy's eyes. "You're coming with me?" The boy's defiance cracked, replaced by pure confusion. "What? Why? You don't even know me." Jeremiah allowed a faint smile to tug at the corner of his mouth. "Maybe I don't, but I see a lot of myself in you, and I'm not about to let you walk out of here and end up in trouble or worse. So, you've got two options. You can trust me or you can keep running. Your choice." Julian hesitated, his mind battling between suspicion and a flicker of hope he couldn't quite extinguish. "You're serious?" "Dead serious," Jeremiah replied. "Let's go." That night, Jeremiah didn't just take Julian into his home. He opened a door neither of them knew existed. What seemed like a simple act of kindness was the start of a journey that would uncover secrets neither Jeremiah nor Julian were prepared for. As they left the store together, Jeremiah couldn't shake the feeling that this boy wasn't just another lost soul. He was something more, something that would change both their lives in ways Jeremiah could never have imagined. Jeremiah's car cruised through the streets of Dallas, the city's lights flickering across the boy's tense face. Julian sat stiffly in the leather seat, his fingers clutching the candy bar he had refused to put down. The silence between them was heavy, broken only by the hum of the engine. Jeremiah glanced at him occasionally, trying to piece together the mystery of the child who had somehow cracked the armor he'd spent years building. Julian stared out the window, his mind racing. He didn't trust Jeremiah. Why would he? Rich people didn't care about kids like him. At best, they felt pity. At worst, they didn't notice him at all. But Julian wasn't invisible anymore, not tonight. He hated how vulnerable he felt, and yet a small part of him wondered if maybe, just maybe, this man was different. When they arrived at Jeremiah's sprawling mansion on the edge of the city, Julian's jaw tightened. The towering gates and pristine landscaping felt like a slap in the face. "What is this place?" he muttered under his breath, the disdain in his voice unmistakable. "My home," Jeremiah replied simply. He parked the car and opened the door for Julian, who hesitated before stepping out. Inside, the house was even more intimidating. Polished floors, high ceilings, and walls lined with art that looked more expensive than anything Julian could imagine. The warmth of the place only made him feel colder, more out of place. "Hungry?" Jeremiah asked, leading Julian to the kitchen. Julian shrugged but didn't respond. Jeremiah opened the fridge, pulling out a plate of leftovers from the housekeeper's earlier dinner. "Here," he said, setting it down on the counter. Julian hesitated again before taking a seat and picking at the food. Jeremiah leaned against the counter, watching him. "So, Julian," he began, his tone calm but curious, "how long have you been on your own?" Julian froze mid-bite, his eyes darting to Jeremiah before dropping to the plate. "Long enough," he muttered. "That's not an answer." Julian's grip on the fork tightened. "What do you want to hear? That I've been sleeping on benches and stealing to survive? That I don't have a mom or dad waiting for me somewhere?" His voice cracked, betraying the anger he used to shield himself. Jeremiah didn't flinch. He recognized that anger. It was the kind born from hurt and desperation. "I want to hear the truth," he said gently. "Whatever that is." Julian shoved another bite of food into his mouth to avoid answering, but after a long pause, the words spilled out. "My mom died 2 years ago. Overdose. We lived in this crappy apartment, and after she was gone, the landlord kicked me out. Said I couldn't stay there without her. I didn't have anywhere else to go, so I just left." Jeremiah felt a pang in his chest. 2 years. This boy had been living on the streets for 2 years, surviving on scraps and stolen food. "What about your dad?" Julian laughed bitterly. "What dad? Never met him. Don't even know his name." The room fell silent again. Jeremiah's mind raced, torn between anger at the world that had failed Julian and a growing determination to help him. "Do you go to school?" Jeremiah asked, though he already suspected the answer. Julian shook his head. "What's the point? Nobody cares if I show up or not." "I care," Jeremiah said firmly, surprising even himself with the intensity of his words. Julian looked up, his eyes narrowing. "Why? Why do you care? You don't even know me." Jeremiah hesitated, searching for the right words. "Maybe I don't know you, but I know what it's like to feel alone. I know what it's like to think no one's coming to help." Julian scoffed. "What would you know about that? You live in a mansion. You probably had everything handed to you." Jeremiah's jaw tightened, but he didn't let the comment anger him. "You're wrong," he said quietly. "I grew up not far from the store you were in tonight. My mom worked 2 jobs just to keep food on the table, and my dad, well, he wasn't around much either. I know what it's like to struggle, Julian. I know what it's like to fight for every little thing." Julian stared at him, the sharp edges of his distrust softening just slightly. "Then why didn't you stay? Why did you leave?" Jeremiah sighed. "Because I had to. But I'm here now. And so are you." Julian didn't respond, but for the first time that night, he allowed himself to relax just a little. As he finished his meal, Jeremiah knew one thing for certain. This boy wasn't just a fleeting encounter. He was a mirror of the past Jeremiah had spent years trying to forget, and a reminder that some wounds never truly heal until you face them head on. The next morning, Julian woke up to the unfamiliar softness of a bed. The sun poured through the massive windows, casting golden light across the room. For a moment, he thought he was dreaming, but the strange surroundings, the fresh sheets, and the faint scent of coffee drifting from somewhere below reminded him it was real. Julian sat up, rubbing his eyes as a flood of mixed emotions hit him. He wasn't sure if he should be grateful, suspicious, or just scared. He had learned a long time ago that trusting people led to disappointment, and he wasn't about to let his guard down now. Jeremiah, already dressed in his tailored suit, was downstairs at the dining table, reading emails on his tablet. When Julian hesitantly wandered into the room, Jeremiah glanced up. "Good morning," he said, his voice calm but warm. "I wasn't sure if you'd sleep in. There's breakfast on the counter. Help yourself." Julian eyed him warily, as if Jeremiah's kindness was some kind of trap. He made his way to the counter, where a plate of scrambled eggs, bacon, and toast waited. He hadn't had a meal like this in years. For a second, he considered skipping it, just to prove he didn't need Jeremiah's charity. But his empty stomach betrayed him. As he ate in silence, Jeremiah watched, noticing the way Julian held a fork like he expected it to be snatched away at any moment. It was a stark reminder of how much the boy had endured. "I was thinking," Jeremiah began, breaking the silence, "that we could go shopping today. Get you some clothes, shoes, whatever you need." Julian stopped mid-bite, his eyes narrowing. "Why are you doing this? What do you want from me?" Jeremiah leaned back in his chair, meeting Julian's gaze. "I told you last night, Julian. I see myself in you. I know how hard it is to feel like the world's against you. If someone hadn't helped me when I was your age, I wouldn't be here today. I just want to give you the same chance." Julian frowned, processing the words. "And what if I don't want your help? What if I just leave?" Jeremiah shrugged, though his tone remained serious. "That's your choice. I can't force you to stay. But if you do stay, I promise you this. You'll have a roof over your head, food to eat, and a chance to figure out what you want for your life. No strings attached." The boy studied Jeremiah's face, looking for any hint of dishonesty. But all he saw was sincerity. He hated that part of him wanted to believe it. "Fine," Julian muttered. "I'll stay. For now." Jeremiah smiled faintly. "That's all I ask." Later that day, they went to a department store in the heart of Dallas. Julian trailed behind Jeremiah like a shadow, overwhelmed by the towering racks of clothes and the gleaming floors. He felt out of place, like everyone was staring at him, though no one seemed to notice. Jeremiah handed him a shopping basket. "Pick out what you like. Clothes, shoes, whatever you need." Julian hesitated, his fingers gripping the basket tightly. "Anything?" "Anything," Jeremiah confirmed. Julian moved cautiously through the aisles, as if touching the wrong thing might get him kicked out. He chose a few pairs of jeans, some plain t-shirts, and sneakers that weren't too flashy. When he brought them to Jeremiah, the man raised an eyebrow. "That's it." Julian shrugged. "I don't need much." Jeremiah didn't push him, understanding that years of going without had taught the boy to want as little as possible. But as they walked toward the register, Julian stopped, his eyes landing on a simple black hoodie. He hesitated before pulling it off the rack. "Can I get this too?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Jeremiah smiled. "Of course." Back at the house, Julian disappeared into the guest room with his new clothes. Jeremiah sat in his study, staring out the window, lost in thought. Helping Julian had seemed like the right thing to do, but now it felt like more than that. It felt personal. That evening, as they ate dinner, Julian surprised Jeremiah by speaking first. "You said someone helped you when you were my age. Who was it?" Jeremiah paused, caught off guard by the question. "It was a man named Carl. He owned a small store in the neighborhood where I grew up. When my mom lost her job, he gave me work, let me sweep floors and stock shelves. He didn't have much, but he shared what he could." Julian looked at him, curiosity replacing some of his suspicion. What happened to him? Jeremiah's expression softened, a hint of sadness in his eyes. "He passed away a few years ago, but I never forgot what he did for me. He didn't just give me a job. He gave me hope." Julian didn't say anything, but for the first time, he felt a glimmer of something unfamiliar. Trust. Maybe, just maybe, Jeremiah meant what he said, and maybe staying wouldn't be so bad after all. As the night wore on, both Jeremiah and Julian felt the walls between them begin to crack, though neither of them fully understood the bond that was forming, or the secrets that would soon change everything. Weeks passed, and the tension that had once defined Julian's every interaction with Jeremiah began to fade. Slowly but surely, Julian settled into the routine of living in the mansion. He still kept his guard up, but there were moments when he let it drop, moments when he laughed at Jeremiah's dry humor or asked shy questions about his work. Jeremiah, on the other hand, was surprised by how much he enjoyed having Julian around. The boy was sharp, resourceful, and far braver than anyone his age should have to be. It was in the quiet evenings, when Julian would sprawl on the couch watching old action movies, that Jeremiah found himself wondering about the path that had brought them together. But the uneventful routine was shattered one rainy afternoon when Julian stumbled across something he wasn't meant to find. It began innocently enough. Julian had been exploring the house, his curiosity finally outweighing his reluctance to get comfortable. He wandered through the library, ran his fingers along the spines of books he had no intention of reading, and marveled at the dusty old paintings hanging on the walls. In the corner of the library was a desk, cluttered with papers and knickknacks. Julian rifled through them absent-mindedly, thinking maybe he'd find some clue about who Jeremiah really was. But what he found was something entirely unexpected. A photograph. It was old, its edges worn and yellowed, but the image was clear. A woman stood in the center, smiling brightly. Beside her was a man who looked strikingly like a younger Jeremiah. But it was a child in the photo that made Julian's breath catch in his throat. It was him. He didn't remember the picture being taken. How could he? But the boy in the photograph had his same mop of unruly hair, his same piercing brown eyes. Julian stared at it, his chest tightening with confusion and panic. "What the hell is this?" he muttered to himself, flipping the photo over. Written on the back in faded ink were two names, Carla and Jeremiah. Before Julian could make sense of what he was holding, he heard footsteps behind him. He spun around, shoving the photograph into his pocket just as Jeremiah entered the room. "Everything okay?" Jeremiah asked, his tone casual. Julian nodded quickly, his heart pounding. "Yeah, just, looking around." Jeremiah smiled, oblivious to Julian's distress. "Find anything interesting?" Julian forced a shrug. "Not really." Jeremiah nodded and turned to leave. But Julian's mind was racing. Who was the woman in the photo? And why was he in it with Jeremiah? That night, Julian couldn't sleep. The photograph felt like it was burning a hole in his pocket, demanding answers he didn't have. Finally, he slipped out of bed and crept to Jeremiah's office, determined to find more clues. The desk drawers were locked, but Julian had learned how to pick locks years ago. It didn't take long for him to pry them open. Inside, he found a folder labeled Carla. His hands trembled as he opened it. Newspaper clippings, legal documents, and more photographs spilled out. The clippings told the story of a young woman, Carla, who had gone missing years ago. The legal documents included birth records, one of which listed Julian as her son. And then there was a letter, written in shaky handwriting. Jeremiah, if anything happens to me, please take care of Julian. He's all I have. Julian's world tilted. His mother had known Jeremiah. She had trusted him enough to leave him with this responsibility. But why hadn't Jeremiah said anything? Had he even known? Lost in his thoughts, Julian didn't hear Jeremiah enter the room. "What are you doing?" Jeremiah's voice was sharp, filled with a mixture of confusion and anger. Julian turned, holding up the folder. "You tell me," he said, his voice trembling. "Who was Carla? And why am I in that picture?" Jeremiah's expression softened as he saw the folder. He took a deep breath, his shoulders sagging as if the weight of years of secrets had finally caught up to him. "Carla was my sister," Jeremiah admitted, his voice low. "She was your mother." Julian staggered back, the words hitting him like a punch to the gut. "No, that's not possible. You're lying." "I wish I were," Jeremiah said. He stepped closer, his eyes filled with regret. "I didn't know about you until recently. When she disappeared, I looked everywhere for her, but I never found her. I didn't know she had a son. I didn't know she had you." Tears welled up in Julian's eyes. "Why didn't she tell me about you? Why did she leave me alone?" Jeremiah shook his head. "I don't have all the answers, Julian, but I swear to you, if I had known, I would have been there. I would have taken care of you." Julian felt his knees buckle, and Jeremiah caught him before he could fall. In that moment, the walls between them shattered completely. Both of them were broken in different ways, but they had found each other, family they never knew they had. And as the rain continued to pour outside, Julian realized that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as alone as he thought. The revelation hit Julian like a freight train, leaving him grappling with emotions he wasn't prepared to face. Jeremiah was his uncle, the man who had taken him and wasn't a stranger with misplaced pity but family he never knew he had. The thought both comforted and infuriated him. Why had his mother kept this from him? Why had Jeremiah stayed silent until now? For days, the mansion was filled with an uneasy silence. Julian avoided Jeremiah, retreating into his room to process the truth on his own. He spent hours staring at the photograph he'd found, his fingers tracing the faces in the picture, trying to piece together a story that felt like it was missing too many chapters. Jeremiah, meanwhile, struggled with his own guilt. He hadn't wanted to overwhelm Julian with the truth, especially after seeing how guarded the boy was. But now, the damage was done, and he was desperate to repair their fragile bond. One evening, unable to stand the tension any longer, Jeremiah knocked on Julian's door. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice gentle. Julian hesitated, but eventually opened the door. He didn't say anything, just crossed his arms and stared at Jeremiah with wary eyes. Jeremiah stepped inside, holding a small box in his hands. "I found this while going through some old things. It belonged to your mom. I thought you might want to see it." He placed the box on the desk and stepped back, giving Julian space. Curious despite himself, Julian opened the lid. Inside were trinkets from a life he barely remembered. A small locket with a picture of him as a baby, a stack of letters, and a tattered stuffed bear he recognized instantly. She used to call that bear Mr. Fuzzy, Jeremiah said with a faint smile. She never went anywhere without it when she was your age. Julian picked up the bear, his fingers brushing against its worn fur. "Why didn't she ever tell me about you?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. Jeremiah sighed, pulling a chair over to sit. "Your mom and we had a complicated relationship. She was younger than me by 10 years. When our parents died, I had to step up and take care of her. But I wasn't always good at it. We argued a lot. When she left, I thought she just needed space. I never imagined she was trying to protect you." "Protect me from what?" Julian asked, his brow furrowing. Jeremiah hesitated. "Your mom had some trouble in her life. She got involved with people who weren't good for her. She probably thought keeping me out of the picture would keep you safe. But I think she always meant to come back." Julian's chest tightened. He wanted to be angry, but the sadness in Jeremiah's eyes mirrored his own. "And now she's gone," he said quietly. Jeremiah nodded, his voice heavy. "Yeah, she's gone. But that doesn't mean you're alone, Julian. You have me now. And I promise I'll do whatever it takes to make things right." For the first time in days, Julian looked at Jeremiah without suspicion. There was something in his uncle's tone that made him believe the words. The following week, Jeremiah suggested they visit a nearby park. "Your mom used to love this place," he said. "She always said it was where she felt the most free." Julian agreed reluctantly, not sure if he wanted to dredge up more memories. But when they arrived, he found himself struck by how peaceful the park was. Tall oak trees shaded the walking paths, and children laughed as they played by the pond. Jeremiah led him to a bench overlooking the water. "This is where she told me she was pregnant with you," he said. "She was so scared, but she was also excited. She said she'd never been more sure of anything in her life." Julian stared at the water, letting Jeremiah's words sink in. For so long, he had thought of himself as an unwanted burden. Hearing this changed something inside him. They sat in silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. Then Jeremiah reached into his pocket and pulled out the locket from the box. "I had this cleaned up for you," he said, handing it to Julian. Julian opened it, revealing the tiny photo of his baby face on one side and his mother's on the other. Tears welled up in his eyes as he closed it and slipped it around his neck. "Thanks," he said, his voice barely audible. Jeremiah placed a hand on his shoulder. "We've both lost a lot, Julian, but we still have each other, and I think that's a pretty good place to start." As they left the park, Julian felt a small but undeniable shift. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like he was carrying the weight of the world alone. He had questions, so many questions, but he also had hope, and that, he realized, was more than enough for now. What neither of them knew was that their journey of healing was only just beginning. There were still secrets to uncover, challenges to face, and a bond to rebuild. But for the first time, both Jeremiah and Julian felt ready to face the future together. The fragile bond that Julian and Jeremiah had begun to build was put to the test when an unexpected visitor arrived at the mansion one late afternoon. The doorbell's sharp chime echoed through the house, and Julian, who had been engrossed in a book from the library, went to answer it out of habit. Standing on the doorstep was a man in a dark suit, his sharp features shadowed by the brim of his hat. His piercing blue eyes locked onto Julian, and for a moment, the boy felt a chill run down his spine. "Is Jeremiah Ward home?" the man asked, his voice smooth but carrying an unsettling edge. "Who's asking?" Julian shot back, trying to mask his unease. The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Let's just say I'm an old acquaintance. Name's Victor, and you must be Julian." Julian stiffened. "How do you know my name?" Before Victor could answer, Jeremiah appeared behind Julian, his expression hardening the moment he saw the man on the porch. "Victor," Jeremiah said, his tone cold. What are you doing here? Victor stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, brushing past Julian as if he didn't exist. We need to talk, Jeremiah. It's about Carla. Julian froze at the mention of his mother's name. He turned to Jeremiah, his eyes demanding answers. Jeremiah sighed, closing the door behind him. Julian, go to your room. This isn't your concern. The hell it's not, Julian shot back. If it's about my mom, I deserve to know. Victor chuckled, clearly amused by Julian's defiance. The kid's got a point, Jeremiah. He's in this now, whether you like it or not. Jeremiah hesitated, then gestured for Julian to follow them into the living room. Once they were seated, Victor leaned back in his chair, his eyes scanning the room as if cataloging every detail. Carla owed me a debt. He began, his tone casual but his words cutting. A big one. And when she disappeared, she left me with nothing. Now that I've found you two, I think it's time we settle accounts. Jeremiah's jaw tightened. I don't owe you anything, Victor. Whatever happened between you and Carla has nothing to do with us. Victor smirked. Oh, but it does. See, when Carla couldn't pay, she offered me something else instead, information. She told me about you, Jeremiah, about your success, your fortune. She said you'd take care of her debts if anything ever happened to her. And now here I am, ready to collect. Julian's fist clenched as he listened. You're lying, he said. My mom would never do that. Victor's expression darkened. You don't know her as well as you think, kid. Desperation makes people do things they never thought they'd do. Jeremiah stood, his voice low and dangerous. Get out, Victor. You're not getting a cent from me. Victor didn't flinch. If you think this is over, you're mistaken. I'll give you some time to reconsider, but make no mistake. I always get what I'm owed. With that, he tipped his hat to Julian and left, leaving a heavy silence in his wake. Julian turned to Jeremiah, his voice trembling with anger. Why didn't you tell me about him? About any of this? Jeremiah ran a hand through his hair, his shoulders slumping. I didn't know. I had no idea Carla was involved with someone like Victor. She never told me. But you knew something, Julian pressed. You knew she was in trouble, didn't you? Jeremiah nodded reluctantly. I suspected, but I thought it was something she could handle. I was wrong. Julian stormed out of the room, his mind racing. For the first time since moving in with Jeremiah, he felt like he couldn't trust him. Over the next few days, the tension in the house was palpable. Jeremiah tried to talk to Julian, but the boy kept his distance, retreating into himself. At night, he lay awake, haunted by Victor's words. Had his mother really been that desperate? And if so, how far would Victor go to get what he wanted? The answer came sooner than either of them expected. One night, while Jeremiah was out, Julian heard a noise downstairs. He crept to the top of the staircase and saw Victor standing in the foyer, flanked by two large men. Jeremiah's not here, Julian said, trying to keep his voice steady. Victor smiled up at him. I'm not here for him tonight. I'm here for you. Julian's blood ran cold. Before he could react, Victor's men started up the stairs. Julian darted back to his room, slamming the door and locking it. His heart pounded as he searched for something, anything, he could use to defend himself. He grabbed a heavy lamp and braced himself as the men pounded on the door. Just as the door splintered under their weight, Julian heard the roar of an engine outside. Moments later, Jeremiah burst into the house, his voice thundering through the halls. Get away from him. The next few minutes were a blur of chaos. Jeremiah fought off the men with a ferocity Julian hadn't known he possessed. By the time the police arrived, Victor and his goons were gone, but the damage was done. As they sat together in the aftermath, Julian looked at Jeremiah with new eyes. He was still angry, still hurt, but for the first time, he saw the depth of Jeremiah's commitment to protecting him. "I'll never let anyone hurt you, Julian," Jeremiah said, his voice firm. "Not as long as I'm alive." And for the first time, Julian believed him. The night after the attack, the mansion felt eerily quiet. Julian sat by the window in his room, staring out at the darkened streets of Dallas, his mind spinning with the events of the past few days. His pulse still raced from the confrontation with Victor and his men, and though he tried to convince himself he wasn't afraid, the truth was he was terrified. He had never been in a situation like that before, and seeing Jeremiah fight with such desperation had shaken him to his core. Jeremiah, however, had acted as though he was prepared for it, as though he had been expecting trouble. That thought gnawed Julian. He had seen a side of his uncle he hadn't known existed, the protective, ruthless side that came out when it mattered most. But what did it mean for their relationship? How much of what Jeremiah had told him was true, and how much had he been hiding all along? He had no answers, and that uncertainty weighed heavily on him. He wanted to believe that his uncle was doing his best to protect him, but with every revelation, the line between trust and betrayal blurred. The next day, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the mansion, Julian found himself standing in front of Jeremiah's office door. He hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but he had overheard part of a conversation earlier. Jeremiah had been on the phone, his voice tight, but there was something in his tone that caught Julian's attention. The words were muffled, but Julian distinctly heard his uncle say, "It's time. I can't keep this from him anymore." That was enough to push Julian to act. He needed to know what Jeremiah was hiding, needed to hear the truth from the one person he'd allowed himself to trust. With a deep breath, he knocked softly on the door. Jeremiah looked up from his desk, surprise flickering in his eyes when he saw Julian standing there. "Julian," he said, his voice strained. "What's going on?" Julian stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "I need to talk to you," he said, his voice firm but filled with uncertainty. "About everything. About Victor, about my mom, and about you." Jeremiah's expression hardened, his jaw tightening as though he knew this moment was inevitable. "I don't want to drag you into this, Julian, but I guess it's time you know the truth." Julian's heart pounded in his chest. The truth about what? Jeremiah motioned for him to sit, his hands resting on the desk as he looked at Julian with a mix of concern and resignation. "The truth about why your mother left you, why she kept you away from me all these years, and why Victor's been after us." Julian sat down, his body tense as he braced himself for whatever Jeremiah was about to reveal. "What are you telling me, Jeremiah?" Jeremiah exhaled slowly, as though weighing his words carefully. "Your mother didn't just leave you to protect you from people like Victor. She left because of me. She was scared of me. I was involved in things back then, things that weren't exactly legal." Julian's brow furrowed, confusion clouding his mind. "What kind of things? You're a successful businessman. How could you be involved in anything illegal?" Jeremiah's face softened, his gaze distant, as if he were reliving the past. "I wasn't always like this, Julian. Before I built this empire, I made choices that weren't the best. I was young, reckless. I got involved with people I shouldn't have, and your mother, she knew about it. She knew I was tangled up in something dangerous, and she wanted out." He paused, as though the weight of his own confession was almost too much to bear. "I didn't protect her. I didn't protect you. And when she left, I thought I could fix everything on my own. But I was wrong. I kept running from my past, hoping it wouldn't catch up with me, hoping that maybe you wouldn't find out." Julian stared at Jeremiah, disbelief and anger bubbling inside him. "So you've been lying to me all this time?" Jeremiah looked at him, his eyes filled with guilt. "I didn't want you to know the truth. I didn't want you to see me as the man I was. I wanted to be the person who could give you everything you needed, the safety, the stability. But I'm still that man, Julian. I made mistakes, and I've been trying to make things right. But I can't do that alone. Julian sat in stunned silence, processing everything Jeremiah had just told him. The pieces of the puzzle started falling into place. But the picture they formed was far darker than anything he could have imagined. His mother hadn't just left to protect him from a dangerous world. She had fled to protect him from the very man who now claimed to care for him. "You want me to forgive you?" Julian asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. "I want you to understand," Jeremiah said quietly. "I want you to understand why I've kept you in the dark, why I've pushed you away. But above all, I want you to know that I've been trying every day to be the man you deserve." Julian's mind was a storm of conflicting emotions, anger, betrayal, confusion. But underneath it all, there was something else, a flicker of the same hope that had sparked in him when he first moved into the mansion. Jeremiah wasn't perfect. He wasn't the man Julian had imagined, but he was still trying. And for the first time, Julian realized that maybe, just maybe, they could rebuild something between them. "I don't know if I can ever forgive you," Julian said, his voice shaking. "But I'm willing to try. Just don't lie to me again." Jeremiah nodded. His expression won a profound relief. "I promise, Julian. No more lies." As Julian left the office, he knew this was just the beginning of a long journey, one that would take him through the pain of the past and into an uncertain future. But for the first time, he didn't feel alone, and that in itself was a step toward healing. The days following their conversation were heavy with silence. Julian couldn't help but replay Jeremiah's words over and over in his mind. The truth about his mother's departure, the dark secrets of Jeremiah's past. It felt like everything he thought he knew had been turned upside down. Still, there was a part of him that wanted to believe that Jeremiah's intentions were genuine, that the man who had given him so much could still be trusted. But the truth was harder to accept. Julian had always seen Jeremiah as a hero, someone who had risen from nothing to build an empire, someone who was above reproach. Now, the man who had taken him in, cared for him, and shown him a world of luxury and comfort was not the person he had imagined. He was a man haunted by his past, a man who had made dangerous decisions, and a man who was still paying the price for those choices. Julian spent more time alone in his room, reflecting on everything that had been said. The mansion, once a symbol of safety and security, now felt like a gilded cage. The walls seemed to close in around him, the weight of his own thoughts suffocating him. He couldn't escape the question that lingered in his mind. Could he really trust Jeremiah? One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Julian found himself standing in the garden, looking out at the city of Dallas in the distance. The bright lights of the city reflected his inner turmoil, a stark contrast to the darkness he felt inside. He wanted answers, clarity. He wanted to understand who he was in this world and where he fit into Jeremiah's complex life. It was then that he heard the soft crunch of gravel beneath footsteps. He turned to see Jeremiah approaching, his face shadowed by the dimming light. "Julian," Jeremiah said softly, his voice carrying a mixture of concern and resolve. "Can we talk?" Julian nodded but didn't speak. He wasn't sure he was ready to hear anything more, but he knew this conversation was inevitable. It was time for both of them to face the truth, whatever it was. Jeremiah stopped a few feet away, his gaze fixed on the city skyline. "I've been thinking a lot about everything, about the lies I've told you, about the things I've kept from you. And I know you're angry. I don't blame you for that." Julian crossed his arms, trying to maintain a semblance of control over his emotions. "I don't know what to believe anymore, Jeremiah. You said I should understand you. But how can I understand someone who lied to me for so long?" Jeremiah sighed, his eyes meeting Julian's. "I never meant to lie to you. I thought I could protect you. I thought keeping you away from the truth would keep you safe. But now I see that was a mistake." There was an uncomfortable silence between them. Julian felt the weight of Jeremiah's words, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was still being hidden from him. He knew there was more, something darker, something that connected his mother's disappearance to Victor's obsession with them. "What aren't you telling me?" Julian finally asked, his voice cracking with frustration. Jeremiah's eyes darkened. "There's one more thing you need to know, Julian. The reason Victor is so determined to get to us, the reason he's been chasing us for so long, has to do with your mother's death." Julian's stomach twisted at the mention of his mother. His throat tightened, and for a moment he couldn't breathe. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Jeremiah looked away, as if the words pained him. "Your mother didn't die in an accident, Julian. She was murdered." The air between them seemed to freeze, the world around Julian blurring, as the weight of Jeremiah's words crashed into him. "What? No. You're lying. She can't be." Julian's voice faltered as the truth began to sink in, shattering everything he had believed about his mother's death. "I didn't want you to know," Jeremiah continued, his voice trembling. "I thought it would destroy you, but I can't keep it from you any longer. Victor, he was behind it. Your mother owed him a large sum of money, and when she couldn't pay, he did the unthinkable. He took her life. And now, he's using her death as leverage to get to me, to get to us." Julian felt as if the ground had been pulled from under him. His world, already shaky, had just crumbled beneath his feet. His mother, the woman he had spent years mourning, had been taken from him by the same man who had haunted their lives. The betrayal ran deep, and the weight of it felt unbearable. "I've spent my entire life thinking she was just gone," Julian said, his voice raw with emotion. "And now you're telling me she was murdered? That Victor killed her." Jeremiah nodded, his eyes filled with sorrow. "I should have protected her, Julian. I should have done something, but I didn't. And now we're both paying the price." Julian stood there in stunned silence, his heart racing in his chest. Everything he thought he knew had been turned upside down. The pain, the loss, the anger, it all bubbled up inside him. His mother's death, the lies, the secrecy. It was all too much to bear. Jeremiah took a step closer, his voice softening. "Julian, I'm so sorry. I know I've made mistakes, and I can't take back the things I've done. But I want you to know that I'm doing everything I can to fix this. I'm not asking for your forgiveness, but I'm asking you to believe that I'm trying." Julian's breath came in ragged gasps as he tried to process everything. For the first time, he saw the weight of Jeremiah's guilt and the desperation in his eyes. But at the same time, the anger inside Julian burned brighter. His mother's death wasn't just a loss. It was a tragedy caused by the very people he had been trying to trust. "I don't know what to do anymore," Julian said, his voice trembling with emotion. "I don't know if I can forgive you for this, but I also don't know if I can leave. I have nowhere else to go." Jeremiah's face softened and he reached out, his hand trembling as he placed it on Julian's shoulder. "You don't have to leave. You don't have to do anything you don't want to. Just know that whatever happens, I'm here for you. I always will be." Julian nodded slowly, his heart heavy with the burden of his choices. His journey with Jeremiah was far from over, but for the first time in a long time, he knew that his next steps would be his own. And whatever the future held, he would face it with the truth in his heart. The weight of that truth would never be easy to bear, but it was his reality now, and with it came the power to decide what kind of life he wanted to lead. The choice was his.